Hello, everyone. Welcome to Our Bodies, Our Lives, the fight for abortion rights. The session today will, of course, focus on the devastating decision by the Supreme Court of the United States this Friday to overturn a 1973 court ruling, Roe v. Wade, that protected a woman's right to choose nationally. And also what pro-choice activists are doing in response there now. I'm Kate O'Neill. I'll be the chair of the meeting. I'm a member of Counterfire in London, but you can tell by my accent that I am American, and I do have a history of activism in the US prior to coming to the UK. I was active on a number of fronts, including in the fight for abortion rights in the 1990s and early 2000s. You could probably call me a Roe era activist. We're very fortunate today to have a guest speaker with us calling in from Chicago, Debby Pope. She is actually an old union sister in the Chicago Teachers Union many years ago when I was a teacher in Chicago. And she currently sits on the executive board of the Chicago Teachers Union, but she is also what we might call now a pre-Roe activist, as she is a veteran of the powerful women's rights movement of the late 60s and early 70s that actually created the conditions in which Roe was passed in the first place. And has also been involved in the movement ever since, advocating for sex education in schools, defending abortion clinics, etc. And has actually most recently been involved in organizing a massive demonstration on Friday in Chicago. And I believe after this session today, we'll also be going to another demonstration. So there's a lot going on at the moment. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Debby. I'm going to kick off the discussion with a few questions. That should be hopefully around 25 minutes or so. We don't have a lot of time today, but then there will be some time for your own questions or comments afterwards, and then Debby can come in at the end. My first question for you, Debby, relates to sort of what the mood is right now in the US among activists, among women, people facing these attacks. Obviously, I'm actually here in the US right now on holiday, so I've been talking to a lot of people, and nobody, of course, is shocked by this decision. The writing's been on the wall since October 2018, when Brett Kavanaugh was appointed to the as a Supreme Court justice by Trump, tipping the balance to an anti-choice Supreme Court. And then the dominoes have been falling ever since. People probably remember a lot of shocks since then. 2019, Alabama passed a 6-week ban without any exception for rape or incest. Last year, Texas passed a 6-week ban, which was actually enforced by people suing their neighbors for having abortions. And then, of course, most recently in the last few weeks, the leaked decision for overturning Roe v. Wade on a case coming from Mississippi called Dobbs v. Versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, and that's of course the case that actually overturned Roe. So, it hasn't been a shock, but on the other hand, I think actually seeing in practice what's happening to people already is probably a jolt for people. I was actually at a demonstration on Friday in Milwaukee. We had incredibly angry people marching through the streets. I'm sure Chicago is very similar, shutting down traffic, and hearing the stories of people who work in abortion centers like Planned Parenthood, where there were actually women in the waiting room waiting for an abortion procedure and had to be told by the staff there that they actually couldn't have their procedure. And beginning to make arrangements to move them to Illinois, that sort of thing for a procedure. So there's a lot going on. I'm sure there's a lot of feelings out there. I'm just wondering from you, Debby, first of all, what's your sense of the feeling out there right now? What's the readiness to fight?
Well, I think you've said most of what I was going to say, Kate, so I'll repeat it in different words, I guess. The mood is angry. The mood is depressed for a minute, and then, no, we have to fight back. I will tell you that at the demonstration in Chicago on Friday night, there were about 5,000 people, and at least 1,000 of them were very young women, women under 25. And that is a real change because I think women of that age really took Roe for granted. They took the rights that they had for granted. And to see them taken away, I think was a shock. And people are really, really angry about this. And it sort of reminds me of you may have a loved one and that loved one is not well and you know that they're going to pass soon and you go and you visit them and you mourn that they aren't going to be able to hold on longer. And yet when they finally do die, it's always a shock. And I think we were all waiting for Roe to be overturned. We were watching. We knew what hideous people, if you can even call them that, were on the Supreme Court. We knew the injustice that the Supreme Court was perpetrating in other decisions it was making. And yet there is a certain little element of shock. Oh, crap, it's now. And I think people were feeling that as well. I think that for people of my generation, like late 60s and above, I would say that it is very sad to see, we didn't win most of the things we fought for I was in high school in the 60s, but we didn't, win most of what we fought for in the 60s and 70s. We didn't end imperialism with our fight against the war in Vietnam, as you may have noticed. We have not put an end to racism, sexism, classism, any of those things. But we did win the right of women to bodily autonomy. We thought we won the right that women could make a decision that they would not have to go to basements and back alleys, that they would not have to die having a medical procedure. And now, poof, a group of primarily men, elderly, right wing, out of touch with the world, just put an end to it. And it sort of points to some real flaws in the capitalist democracy that we live in. But we knew that before. But I think for a lot of people, they had a lot of faith in the institutions of democracy, as we would call them in the United States, and thought that the Supreme Court was sort of above the fray. And this has really pointed out to them that that is not at all true.
Interesting. So it's having a radicalizing effect, it sounds like, on a layer of people, which is a good thing, I suppose, as a silver lining there. Obviously, this is new terrain for the left. Before, the pro-choice movement was fighting to defend Roe nationally, or even against piecemeal restrictions state by state. That's sort of what I was doing when I was there, on things like waiting periods, parental consent, these kinds of things. But now half of the states have outright bans. The other half are sort of hurriedly, hopefully, kind of expanding or codifying access. There's also the issue of the far right. I mean, for so long, they were sort of at the margins. They were outside of clinics protesting, etc. And now, you've got these pregnancy and parenting centers that are being set up around the country. You've got, call centers set up. People even sort of being trapped online and tricked into thinking they're going to get an abortion, but no, they're going to these counseling centers. And then, of course, the law is no longer on our side. You've got people that are going to be facing prosecutions. What strategies does the pro-choice movement have now? How ready are we for this?
I don't think we're very ready at all. The counseling centers that you mentioned are far from new. Back in the 80s, they had set up what we called fake clinics. And we would go and we would demonstrate and protest at fake clinics. We would put out lists on flyers because, of course, there was no internet then, of fake clinics. We would reach out and try to tell people, don't go to these places. These places are going to show you horror films about fetuses and are going to try to guilt trip you into having a baby that you don't feel you can have or don't want to have. And so those are not new. But of course, they're much more funded now than they were. They're much more out in front than they were. And I think the pro-choice movement is not ready. One thing the pro-choice movement is getting ready for, and I've seen this in some very widespread circumstances, is for what they are calling camping. So there's a euphemism of a woman going to another state for an abortion that she is going on a camping trip. And people are setting up camping hotlines and camping guide services and advertising that there's, beautiful camping available in Virginia for women from the South to come to Virginia at this point, or that camping is available in Eastern Washington should women in Montana and Idaho want to seek opportunities to camp in other states. And there's a whole network being set up of people who are going to drive people to appointments in other states. There are networks of people who are fundraising to pay for people to take planes to other states, because some states have no state around them where abortion will be legal, because we have big swaths, particularly of the South, but parts of the West as well, where there will not be any availability. So I think a lot of what's going on now is the activation of self-help networks. Now, as a Marxist, I have very mixed feelings about self-help networks, and I'm going to just lay it out for you. I think it's great when people take power into their own hands and make their own decisions and do things. I think it can be a very empowering thing, particularly for people who are new to politics. But I think it's a huge detour from the kind of fights that we ultimately have to take power and to challenge the decisions and the power. It's an adaptation, and it may be an adaptation we need to do in certain strategic and tactical situations. But it's a huge suck of people's time and energy. And I mean huge. The amount of effort that goes into setting up a network, driving people hundreds of miles, finding them places to stay, finding someone to take them to the clinic, finding someone to take them back, feeding them meals, all of those things. That's not the movement that we need. We need a movement that's going to get rid of the right-wing monsters that are in power, basically. Now, I did hear an awful lot, and Kate, you can maybe say whether you did as well, about the importance of voting Democratic and how we have to elect pro-choice legislators. And, I spent a large part of my life saying I would never vote for a Democrat. And I am now perfectly willing to vote for a Democrat, but I'm not going to build my politics on campaigning for a Democrat. And I'm not going to build my politics on that kind of political activity. We're very fortunate in Illinois to have a really strongly pro-choice governor. It does seem as if this is an issue that he really believes in, and he's been out at all of these demonstrations speaking and saying he wants to make Illinois a beacon for people who are deprived in the Midwest of opportunities, because all of the surrounding states, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, and Indiana, either have or are about to have very restrictive abortion laws. So, I mean, in that sense, it does help to have pro-choice politicians. Of course it does. And you can't objectively deny that, but you can't have a strategy for a movement of electing people who are going to take care of things for you. And I think that was proven by the fact that so many of these damn Democrats voted to approve these Republican right-wing neo-fascist judges who are on the Supreme Court right now.
What kinds of strategies do you think it will take?
I'm sorry, Kate?
What kinds of tactics do you think that?
I'm struggling a little with this. I was in the Socialist Workers' Party in my youth, and I was part of the mass action wing of the anti-Vietnam War movement from the time I was in my teens. And I'm struggling with this because, of course, we need to build mass demonstrations. That's one tactic. But mass demonstrations at this point are not going to get us the right to abortion back. And I'm not really sure how we build this movement if we don't want to build it on an electoral basis, and I don't think we should. And we can build demonstrations which are necessary but not sufficient. I'm not exactly sure where we go with the rest of the movement. I think there are a lot of differences of opinion on this in the pro-choice movement. I don't even like the term pro-choice. I'm going to say in the pro-abortion rights movement, because choice is a very mushy word. And the American public's views on abortion, and I don't know much about the British views on abortion, are very mushy. Americans are pro-choice on the average. Above 50% of people in the United States poll as being pro-choice. But they're not pro-choice in all situations. I am in favor of a woman's right to have an abortion, period. I don't question why she wants to have an abortion. I don't think that there should be any restrictions on her having an abortion any more than there should be restrictions on me having sinus surgery if I need sinus surgery, or, a cataract removed, or whatever it might be. But a lot of Americans say, well, up until such and such a week, and they vary widely on that, or absolutely in the case of rape or incest, yes, or yes, but a young girl's parents need to be notified if she's going to have an abortion. So there are a lot of caveats in people's support of abortion rights. I would call it a soft support in that sense, or a situational support. What people talk about, they say, well, she should have used birth control. She should have been more careful. And it's always on the woman. It's always on the woman. It's never seems to be on the man. And some of these crazy justices on the Supreme Court are going to start going after reproductive rights on a much broader level. Some of them are going to start going after contraception at this point. Some of them are going to start going after all kinds of things. There's a lot of discussion about the morning after pill and whether that's going to be available, whether it can be mailed to certain states. Are women going to have to go to adjoining states to pick it up from post office boxes? There's all kinds of horrible questions that arise.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, even people are even talking about other questions as well. Things like there was I think a Congress member recently was talking about overturning school segregation rulings and all kinds of things. So I think, they're the right's definitely feeling quite confident about this decision now, and especially now that they've got friendly Supreme Court justices in. So obviously there's a much broader fight for the left around these issues as well. I just wanted to see if we could just take a step back for a second, because it's really nice to have a veteran of the late 60s, early 70s here. And I was wondering if you could just say, in a few words, what you think brought us to this point, because the women's movement of the late 60s, early 70s was one of the most radical in the world in the United States. And it really laid the groundwork for the decision. And now we're, one of 4 countries in the world that's actually removed abortion rights for women over the age of 25. How did we get this far? If you can maybe just talk very briefly about the role of the right, the Christian right, and also about the role of the Democrats in their strategy.
Or lack thereof. The Christian right in the United States has been on the ascendancy for quite a while. Reagan was elected president in 1980, and I view that as a turning point in many ways, because prior to that, although the movements had died down in the late 70s, there was not the same kind of a culture of conservatism that came in. I think what happened, and this is a very un-Marxian view of it in a sense, is that the right wing saw that people were a little freaked out by how fast things were changing in our society. And they stepped in and they named that fear. They identified with that fear. They attracted people to their huge mega churches where sometimes you have 10,000 people going, and you have all these TV evangelists. Now, of course, they're on the internet more than on TV. And you have people building a culture of regression, of we have to go back to the days when things were normal, when things were safe, when we all felt the way we did. Now, of course, we know that that didn't really exist except for a relatively small percentage of privileged middle class and upper middle class white people in the United States. That la la land that they refer to, that they fantasize about going back to, is a myth. It was a myth that was built on racism, sexism, homophobia, and it really wasn't that way. The anniversary of the Stonewall Massacre in the United States this weekend, shows you that not everybody was living that American dream that they are attempting to recapture for people. But I think that they've played on people's fears, they've played on people's anxieties, they've played on the fact that the United States has not delivered an increasing standard of living and a better life for people. When I was a kid, my parents were downwardly mobile in the late 50s, and nobody around us in the white sort of marginally middle class was downwardly mobile. And it only happened because my father was ill and he wasn't able to work, and it was just my mother working at a time when women's wages were even less close to equality than they are now. But around us, the middle class white people's lives were getting better. People were buying cars, people were getting houses, people's lives were on the ascent. And then as manufacturing left the United States for cheaper places, as jobs dried up in the 70s, things like that, people's lives ceased to go up, 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 up. And the expectation that was there, people were disappointed and they turned looking for solutions. And the right was there saying, we can bring things back to the way it was before. And of course, that wasn't true, but they were captured on that basis. Now, it's interesting that the right is so Christian-based because, in fact, a majority of people in the United States do not go to church on Sunday. A majority of people in the United States do not define themselves as strongly religious. Lots of people will say, I was raised Lutheran, or I was raised Jewish, or I was raised whatever, but we went to St. Sabina's when I was a kid or whatever. But it's not that they feel a strong identity with religion in the urban centers. Now, you get out there in the prairies, you get out there in the boondocks and stuff, and you have tons of people who identify with these churches, but they're not the majority of the population. But the way that our system is structured in the United States, with 50 states, each of which has equal representation to senators, means that a state like Wyoming or Montana that might have under 1 million people have just as much representation in the Senate as California or New York does. And that throws the balance of things out in a way that you probably can't really imagine with the parliamentary system and the proportional way things are in Britain.
Right. So it seems like a lot of what the movement needs to do is actually expand its base, win a lot of these arguments that we've probably been losing for a couple of decades. And the propaganda side of it, as well as the agitation. That's quite an interesting point. I actually wanted to ask you about, you started talking about inequality in abortion access. And since when I was active in the 90s and early 2000s, I mean, the movement was very, very predominantly white. It was very narrowly focused on abortion rights. We didn't, of course, it was too radical to say abortion, so we said pro-choice all the time. But now, if you look at the movement, it's actually changed a lot. In the last 20 years, it's much more diverse. is a broader set of demands. You have a lot more women of color involved, a lot more LGBT activists involved. The list, it's more of a reproductive rights. It's more about access, not just rights. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and then in particular, some of the questions around the experience of Black women and reproductive rights, because there is sort of a reason why maybe we didn't see as many Black women at these protests, and why it's quite important to raise broader reproductive rights questions, to get more women of color and of course more working class women involved. If you could talk a little bit about especially some of the history of the treatment of Black women in the US.
Okay, so this goes to racism as a broader category than just women. You see situations like the Tuskegee experiment, where syphilis was given to Black men in the early 20th century. You have all kinds of things where not only was healthcare inadequate in the African American community, not only were there fewer hospitals and clinics and stuff, but people were used as guinea pigs, as experiments. People were treated to things that would never have been used on white middle class or upper class people. And so there's a very great fear in the Black community and a mistrust, well earned, of the health community, of the health provider community. We see this.
Sterilization, yeah.
I'm talking not just about sterilization, but about the fact that men at Tuskegee Air Base were given syphilis as part of an experiment. There were all kinds of other situations. Women in Puerto Rico were subject to forced sterilization. There were all kinds of things like that went on, and they engendered a great mistrust. And that mistrust can be seen, for example, in the much lower rate of vaccination for COVID in the African American community, because people just simply don't trust it. It's not that they're not afraid of COVID. Lots of people have been very terrified. We had a lot of Black parents in Chicago who were afraid to send their children to school for fear of them catching COVID. And of course, the COVID rates were much higher in Black and brown communities, partly because of this fear of the vaccination, but also because of more cramped and crowded living quarters and things like that as well, and less access to quality health care. But in terms of the women's movement, there was quite a bit of animosity between Black women who considered themselves feminist activists and white women. And it came from the extremely middle-class background of the white women in the not only pro-choice, but other aspects of the feminist movement of the 70s, and a mistrust because the white women were not looking at the lived experience of the Black women. They were not understanding about racism and about economic problems. They really, really did not look at class. They really did not look at race. They did not look at people whose lives were different than their lives in any way. And that engendered a very great mistrust. There's been a fair amount of writing on the part of some Black feminists about this issue, but mostly it resulted in Black women saying, this isn't my movement. This movement doesn't speak to me. I may want abortion rights. I may want access to birth control. I may want these things, but this movement is not my movement. And then you have the fact that forced sterilization in Black and brown communities, while it was perhaps over in this era that we're talking about in the 70s, there was a very great lingering memory of it and a fear of it, and a feeling that they were trying to basically do a subtle version of genocide against the Black community, and that they were trying to keep Black women from having children, and that they were trying to keep Black women from reproducing. There was a lot of talk and fear about how Black and brown people in the United States were going to become the majority instead of the little contained minorities. And the right wing played on these fears. They are coming to take over your towns and cities and your communities, and above all, your schools. Kate knows this, I'm sure, in terms of the schools, that this fear was propagated in a big way. So I think the fact that the movement was divorced from economics and that we lost federal funding for abortion in 1976, so just a few years after Roe with the Hyde Amendment, I think that had a big factor on things because at that point, it was no longer treated as a healthcare service that people could get in that way. And, you know, it's one thing. I was pregnant at 17. I didn't have any money. I was a college student. I had gone off to college early. And what did I do? I went to a phone booth and I called my big brother, Collect, and he was in graduate school at Columbia in New York. And he had not a lot of money, of course, because he was a graduate student who worked in the summers, but he scraped together the several $100s I needed. He went to the Women's Center at Columbia. He found out where I could go in Pennsylvania that a doctor did after hours abortions in his deserted area office downtown in Pittsburgh, a big city in Pennsylvania. He helped me figure out how to get on a flight and fly to Pittsburgh. And he found a brother of somebody he went to grad school with who lived in Pittsburgh for me to stay with for 2 nights after the abortion. So I had a network based on my middle-class white lady connections that Black and brown women simply did not have. And I was able to get an illegal but safe abortion at 17,
Right.
you know, shortly before Roe was legalized.
Right.
But that sort of points to the differences to me.